I used to think war was about courage. Propaganda taught us that. Hollywood taught us that. They lied. Courage helps you stand there, staring down the muzzle. But it doesn't change the physics of 75 millimeters of high explosive failing to penetrate 80 millimeters of hardened, sloped steel. The real lesson of the bocage wasn't about the skill of the crews. It was about metallurgy. It was about the cold, objective truth that the enemy didn't just build tanks. They built mobile bunkers designed to absorb everything we could throw at them, and then erase us with contemptuous ease. We weren't fighting men anymore. We were fighting the German industrial commitment to maximum protection. And our machine, the celebrated M4 Sherman, felt like nothing more than a cheap, fast target. The air in the turret still smelled of stale sweat, cordite, and the metallic tang of fear from the briefing 3 hours ago. It was just past dawn, but the sun was a rumor filtered through the low, thick cloud cover and the dense canopy of the apple orchards. Everything was wet: the soil, the canvas of our gear, the inside of my uniform. I leaned my head back against the periscope, trying to filter the world down to just the sound of our engine idling. The roar of the Continental radial was loud, too loud, a constant announcement of our position. German veterans could probably tell the engine type, the tank model, and our approximate fuel load just from the vibration. "Status, gunner?" I muttered into the throat mic. "Loaded AP, Sarge. Ready to punch a hole." Lieutenant Schmidt, my gunner, was 18. He spoke with the confidence of a kid who hadn't yet had a round bounce off a panther's frontal plate and shatter his illusions. "Keep your eyes open, Schmidt. The hedge in front is too quiet." We were hugging the treeline, a small, weary metal turtle trying to inch forward through a landscape tailor-made for ambush. This entire region, the bocage, was a logistical nightmare. Every field was separated by massive, earthen hedgerows, sometimes 10 feet high, ancient things packed with roots and rock. Each one was a ready-made anti-tank barrier, turning a field into a lethal killing chute. Our objective was nominal: push 400 yards toward the crossroads near a ghost village called Les Champs. The real objective was just movement. We had been stalled for 10 days. Suddenly, Corporal Myers, the loader, swore under his breath. "Sarge, I feel it again. Low rumble. Not ours." I pressed my face tight against the glass. The vibration. It wasn't the distant, comforting rumble of our own divisional artillery. This was closer, deeper, a seismic hum that spoke of mass. Heavy steel, moving slowly, cautiously. "Driver, hold position. Engine low idle. Everyone listen." The Continental settled into a muted burble. In the ensuing silence, the sound sharpened. It was the distinct, uneven clanking of massive tracks, not the rubber-padded tracks of the Sherman, but the heavy, unyielding steel of something huge. A few seconds later, the world stopped caring about our feelings. Crump. The sound wasn't a blast. It was an industrial event. It sounded like God slamming a freight train door. The flash of the muzzle was visible maybe 300 yards to our flank, hidden behind a clump of oak. The report was the high-velocity 75mm L/70 of a German Panther Os. I didn't need to see the impact. I saw the immediate consequence. The third tank in our column, an M4A3 nicknamed Clementine, stopped dead. Not just disabled, but physically wrenched sideways. "Contact! Panther, estimated 300 yards, 11 o'clock low!" I screamed, my voice cracking over the comms. "Schmidt, traverse left. Heat round. Fire!" Schmidt was fast. We had less than 2 seconds. The turret groaned, the stabilizer trying desperately to compensate for the slight incline. "On target, Sarge! Firing!" Whump! The 75mm shell left the muzzle with a familiar, satisfying shove. We all held our breath, waiting for the counter-explosion, the glorious puff of black German smoke that meant a kill. Instead, we got a wet clang. The sound of our shell hitting the Panther's sloped front plate was nauseating. It was the sound of a metal baseball bat hitting a bell tower. The round didn't explode. It barely scratched the paint before shattering or simply deflecting. "No penetration!" Schmig yelled, disbelief mixing with rising panic. "Sarge, it just bounced!" "I saw it, Schmidt." "Loader, get AP up. Get a follow-up ready. Driver, reverse. Now!" Before my driver, Kenny, could even shift gears, the Panther responded. The second German round arrived with a shrieking, metallic whine that cut through the engine noise and the noise-dampening headset. It hit the same spot on Clementine's front glacis. This time, the effect was terminal. The round drove straight through, turning the inside of the Sherman into a pressurized hell of shrapnel and white-hot gas. A huge column of black, greasy smoke instantly erupted from Clementine's hatches. I watched, horrified, as two figures scrambled out of the commander's and driver's hatches, human torchbearers, screaming in a high-pitched, inhuman register, dropping almost instantly into the muddy ditch. They were dead before they hit the ground, not from the blast, but from the unstoppable heat that flashed through the small, inadequately protected turret. Clementine was already burning. It wasn't just smoking, it was engulfed. I felt the familiar, cold knot in my gut, the one that told me the ugly truth about the M4. The truth they didn't teach you in Fort Knox. We weren't fighting machines. We were fighting mathematics. And the equation was wrong. We had speed and numbers. They had thickness and caliber. "Kenny, move! Get us out of this line of sight!" We pulled back, scraping the dense, scratchy earth of the hedgerow. My heart was pounding not just from the adrenaline, but from the realization that we had fired the best shell we had, and it had been completely ignored. Our presence was an insult to the German tank crew, not a threat. This is the war, I thought, grinding my teeth, where your bravery is irrelevant because your machine is obsolete before the first shot is fired. We had lost a tank and 2 men, not to superior tactics, but to a simple, brute force failure of engineering. And we hadn't even scratched the paint on the monster hiding in the oaks. We hadn't won a duel. We'd just been erased from the ledger. The retreat was agonizingly slow. We were reversing blind through thick undergrowth, dragging the dense roots of the hedgerow, the engine screaming in protest. Every fiber of my being expected the high-velocity punch of the Panther to find us again, to finish the equation. "Kenny, swing hard right! We need the cover of that low stone wall!" I yelled. Kenny wrestled the levers. The heavy M4 groaned, pivoting violently, throwing the crew against the walls of the turret. My head slammed against the radio box. The radio, predictably, crackled with static useless. The moment stretched, taut and thick like cold molasses. We cleared the first 30 yards. We were safe. I started to breathe again. And then, the world corrected my arrogance. The hit didn't come from the Panther. It came from an angle we weren't covering, from an anti-tank emplacement we hadn't spotted, buried deep in the next line of bushes. The sound was less of a roar than a clean, catastrophic crack. It was the sound of a giant, metallic whip being snapped. The round, I later guessed it was a 75mm Pak 40, hit us square in the sponson, low on the right side, where the armor was thin and, more importantly, where the ready racks for the main gun ammunition were stored on our M4A1 model. The impact was immediate, brutal, and total. A searing, white-hot lance of steel and explosive energy punched through the hull. The air inside the tank instantaneously compressed, forcing a painful woof from my lungs. Shrapnel ricocheted maniacally inside the turret, a deadly, high-speed, three-dimensional game of pinball. I felt a sharp, incandescent pain rip through my left arm and shoulder. It felt like being struck by 100 pieces of burning ice. But the pain of the shrapnel was secondary. The primal terror was the fire. The penetration round ignited the hydraulic fluid running through the recoil mechanism. More critically, the shockwave and heat instantly set off the dry-stowed shells in the side sponson. The tank didn't just burn. It erupted. The immediate atmosphere was a choking mix of noxious fumes and boiling heat. The temperature inside the turret went from damp summer humidity to furnace intensity in less than half a second. The pressure built up, forcing the internal gases and fire out of every available opening. "Bail out! Bail out! Get out!" I roared, though the word was barely a croak over the roaring fire. Schmidt was slumped over his gun, motionless. Myers was struggling with the loader's hatch, his face already slick with black soot. Instinct took over, stripping away all doctrine and training. My shoulder screamed, but the pain was distant. Survival demanded action. I shoved myself up through the commander's hatch. The air outside was cool, a merciful contrast to the inferno below, but the smoke plume was instantly choking. I heard the frantic clicking of the driver's hatch being released. Kinney, thank God, was alive and scrabbling out. I grabbed Schmidt's collar and tried to heave him up. He was heavy, dead weight. K-rumph. The first internal round detonated. It blew the gun mantle slightly askew and slammed me back down onto the turret ring. My helmet flew off. "Leave him!" A cold, rational voice in my mind screamed. "He's gone. Save yourself." I scrambled out, dropping onto the hull, then rolling desperately off the side and into the deep, muddy ditch next to the hedgerow. I landed hard, the cold, damp earth a shocking relief against my skin. The world was spinning. I tried to focus, spitting out blood and mud. Kinney landed beside me, coughing violently. "Sarge, we've lost Myers," he wheezed, pointing to the loader's hatch. It was jammed, surrounded by curling tongues of bright orange flame. We didn't wait. We crawled deeper into the ditch, the adrenaline masking the throbbing agony in my shoulder. We looked back. Our M4A1, Hellion, was now a blazing monument to the failure of mass production. Ammunition was cooking off rapidly, turning the surrounding air into a lethal concert of explosions. The flames were bright yellow, fueled by high-octane gasoline and hydraulic fluid, a perfect, roaring fire pit. I lay there, watching the tank I commanded die. We called them Ronsons, or Zippos, tanks that lit up on the first hit. Before this, I dismissed it as dark humor. Now, the myth was reality. This wasn't bad luck. It was a design flaw, a cost-benefit analysis made in Detroit by men who never had to smell burning flesh. The design was inherently compromised, fast to build, easy to maintain, but deadly to its own crew when penetrated. We had been sacrificed to the clock. I closed my eyes against the blinding light of the flames. The realization settled in my chest, heavy and cold as unspent steel. The enemy's advantage wasn't just in the size of their guns. It was in the deliberate choice we made to prioritize quantity and speed over crew survivability. The only difference between me and the three poor bastards still inside was 3 seconds and a lucky drop into the mud. The next 3 weeks were a blur of sterile white tints, the smell of antiseptic, and the throbbing ache of torn muscle and minor burns. The shrapnel had been removed. The psychological damage was permanent. I kept seeing the bright, clean flame that consumed Hellion, hearing the cheerful pop of the cooking rounds. When I was deemed fit enough to walk, but not yet fit to fight in a turret, they shuffled me back. Not home, but to an ordnance maintenance depot near Cherbourg. My field promotion to lieutenant was rushed through, a medal and a new job, taking me away from the front lines, tasked with inspecting equipment, writing reports, and chasing down parts. A logistics officer. A desk jockey with burned scars. This was where I met Captain Alistair Maguire. He wasn't a tanker. He was a gearhead, a mechanical engineer fresh out of MIT who saw war not as a battle of men, but as a test of supply chain efficiency. I found him hunched over a partially gutted M4A3 hull in a cavernous, noisy workshop dominated by the rhythmic clang of repair crews hammering bed tracks straight. "Lieutenant Donovan," Maguire said, not looking up, his glasses low on his nose. "They said you know what it's like to draw the short straw. I know what it's like to be cooked inside 28 tons of steel, Captain." I stared at the half-finished hull, the engineering fix that was too late for my friends. I finally understood the terrifying contrast. We were fighting German ideology with American logistics. And the M4 Sherman was the physical embodiment of the assembly line, disposable, fast, and ultimately overwhelming. My job now was not to fight the enemy, but to ensure this mechanical wave never stopped rolling. The transition was jarring. From the confined, sensory overload environment of the tank turret, I was thrust into the sprawling, impersonal chaos of logistics. By December 1944, I was Lieutenant Donovan, Technical Liaison Officer, tasked with overseeing the flow of replacement armor and specialized parts to forward units in the quiet sector of the Belgian Ardennes. The Ardennes. Quiet. That was the joke. The snow started falling heavily on December 16th, insulating the world in a deceptive, muffled silence. It was the same day the Germans launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. We called it the Battle of the Bulge. I was stationed near a primary supply dump, a vast, frozen canvas of crates, fuel drums, and vehicles stretching back miles. My job was simple: match the supply requests, tanks, track assemblies, high explosive rounds, with the dwindling stocks and try to keep the supply line moving forward over roads rapidly turning to sheets of ice. The initial reports filtered in like static. German armor breakthrough. Unidentified heavy units. Total collapse of the forward screening troops. The German spearhead wasn't just fast, it was monstrous. They were throwing everything they had: Panthers, the mighty Jagdpanzer IVs, and, worst of all, the dreaded King Tigers Tiger II, tanks that made the old Tiger I look like a scout car. I saw the logical result of the attack almost instantly, not in the fighting, but in the logistics. The American side was pure chaos, but it was organized chaos. Truck convoys, hundreds deep, were grinding to a halt in the snow, not because we lacked fuel or supplies, but because the road network was choked. We had too much stuff. I spent 72 hours awake, drinking lukewarm coffee, coordinating supply distribution. My radio headset was a constant source of panicked, coded requests. "Needs 75mm AP, grid 34 Bravo. We're down to high explosive only. Requesting engine block for M4A3. Transmission seized due to mud contamination." The irony was blinding. The Germans were attacking through terrain so challenging that their superb, heavy machinery was immediately breaking down. The King Tigers, magnificent 50-ton weapons, were consuming astronomical amounts of fuel the Wehrmacht simply didn't possess in the required quantity. I saw reports of German tanks abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they ran dry or broke a complex final drive that required specialized tooling and factory precision to repair. Our Shermans? They were breaking down too. Transmissions seizing in the relentless cold, engines overheating when pushed too hard through the snowdrifts. But when an M4 broke down, the crew simply radioed the ordnance. Within 12 hours, a specialized recovery vehicle, often an M32 tank recovery vehicle, which was itself based on the Sherman chassis, would arrive. If the tank was too far gone, we would cannibalize it. I directed a recovery team to a shelled crossroads where an M4A1 had lost a track and been abandoned. We needed the running gear. As we drove past, The scene was a perfect encapsulation of our respective strengths. The M4 lay sideways, a mess, but reparable. A mile further, we passed a massive German column that had been wiped out by a squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts once the weather briefly cleared. Among the wrecks stood a solitary, intact Jagdpanzer IV, angled uselessly into a ditch. "Why didn't the crowds try to tow that beast out, Lieutenant?" asked Corporal Jenkins, my driver, shaking his head at the imposing bulk of the self-propelled gun. "Look closer, Jenkins," I ordered. We stopped the jeep. The German machine was mechanically perfect, except for one flat tire on a road wheel, which had led to the final drive overheating. The crew had clearly tried to fix it, but the weight of the chassis meant the simplest roadside repair became a near impossible task without dedicated recovery gear and a specialized crew. The German approach to engineering was that every component must be perfect, regardless of complexity. The American approach was that every component must be simple enough that any GI mechanic with a wrench and a prayer can fix it. I suddenly saw the M4 Sherman not as a flawed tank, but as a strategic philosophy. It was designed to be fixable and replaceable, a piece of a vast, churning war machine that could absorb localized failures without stopping the entire operation. The fog of war began to clear around Christmas. The supply line stabilized, aided by the sheer determination of the American Logistics Corps, the truck drivers, the engineers, the mechanics. While the 101st Airborne held Bastogne, we ensured they were eventually supported by enough armor and ammunition to not just survive, but counterattack. I received an order to personally oversee the technical evaluation of a captured King Tiger near La Gleize. It was one of the few fully intact heavy tanks the Germans had abandoned. The day we reached the site was brutally cold. The King Tiger stood colossal in the snow, a steel behemoth, its long 88mm KWK-43 gun angled toward the sky. It was mesmerizing. It looked powerful, indestructible, terrifying. I climbed up onto the glassy plate, rubbing my frozen hands together. The armor was almost 10 inches thick in places, sloped and overlapping. Even the late-model 76mm guns on our Shermans would struggle to penetrate this monster frontally. "A piece of art, isn't it, Lieutenant?" asked Sergeant Riker, a mechanic specializing in engines. He was running diagnostics on the massive Maybach HL-230P30 engine. "It's a declaration of faith in over-engineering, Riker. And a logistical nightmare," I said, walking around to the back. The engine compartment was immense and complex. The power-to-weight ratio was terrible. The machine was starved for acceleration and constantly stressed the transmission. Riker's report was predictable. The final drive had failed spectacularly after less than 150 kilometers of difficult travel. They had no choice but to blow the breech and abandon it. "Too heavy, no fuel, no way to tow it out of this snow," Riker concluded, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice into the fresh white snow. While Riker worked, I examined a different scene 50 yards away. A M4A3 from the 4th Armored Division had been disabled by a near-miss artillery strike. Its turret was jammed, the suspension damaged, but the chassis was intact. A repair crew was already working. They had stripped the damaged suspension bogies and were preparing to install new ones, sourced from a nearby supply truck. I watched two GIs, stripped down to undershirts despite the freezing air, wrestling a bogie assembly into place. They were using standardized wrenches, a large hammer, and sheer force of will. No precision instruments, no specialized cranes. I walked back to the King Tiger and ran my hand across its thick, cold side. "You won the duels, you brute," I muttered under my breath, my voice echoing slightly in the heavy air. "You could obliterate 4 of us before we could scratch you." But then I looked back at the American repair crew, fighting the metal. The King Tiger required 7 liters of fuel to travel 1 kilometer. It took 3,000 man-hours to build. If it broke down, it was often permanently lost. The M4 Sherman required 3.5 liters per kilometer. It took 600 man-hours to build. If it broke down, we stripped it, fixed it, or replaced it immediately. The comparison: I was standing between two competing visions of industrial warfare. Germany sought to build the ultimate tank, maximizing individual combat superiority. The U.S. sought to build the optimal tank, maximizing production volume and maintainability. The U.S. was losing the tactical score, but winning the strategic war. We traded the lives of tankers like me for the inexorable grind of the assembly line. The truth crystallized fully in a bunker deep beneath a supply depot, amid stacks of manifests and casualty reports. The counteroffensive had begun, and the numbers were staggering. I was processing the casualty lists for the Ardennes sector, the lost tanks, and the reasons for their loss. German losses were heavy. But what struck me was the breakdown. 35% total loss due to direct combat action, anti-tank fire air strikes. 65% total loss due to abandonment, lack of fuel, mechanical breakdown, inability to recover/repair. American losses were also heavy, especially in the initial phase. 55% total loss due to combat action. 45% total loss due to mechanical failure/abandonment. The raw combat loss percentage for the M4 was higher than for the German vehicles. The Zippo reputation was statistically justified. We were easier to destroy. But then I looked at the replacement rate. For every King Tiger or Panther lost, the German factory produced a slow, agonizing trickle of substitutes. The Allies were destroying the German capacity for war. For every Sherman lost, an equivalent replacement chassis was already sitting on a freighter crossing the Atlantic, or was being loaded onto a railcar in England, or was being salvaged and rebuilt 50 miles behind the front. My pen hovered over a report detailing the arrival of a new shipment of M4A3E8 tanks, the Easy 8s, equipped with the long 76mm M1A2 gun and the horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS, giving them superior off-road speed and the ability to finally challenge the Panthers frontally. The logistics had finally caught up to the engineering flaw that killed my crew in Normandy. The fix, the wet stowage, the better gun, the superior suspension, was here. But it took 6 agonizing months of fighting and dying in substandard machines to buy the time for the factories to churn out the improved versions. Central revelation: I finally understood that the M4 Sherman was not a tank. It was a factory floor with tracks. The sheer quantity of American production, the fact that Detroit could build more tanks in a week than the Reich could build in a month, meant that individual unit quality became a secondary concern. It wasn't that the M4 was good. It was that it was mass-produced, and just good enough to keep fighting until the superior numbers suffocated the enemy. I wrote in my personal log, the cold assessment cutting through the lingering memory of the fire. They aimed for perfection. We aimed for continuity. The German design philosophy was predicated on the belief that a few superior instruments could shatter 1,000 lesser ones. They failed to calculate the endless, crushing tonnage of democracy's industrial might. Our losses are terrible, but they are a renewable resource. Their losses are finite. We are not fighting a duel. We are administering a statistical defeat. The King Tiger was a masterpiece. The Sherman was a calculator of victory. And the calculator was running fast. The orders came in late February 1945. The logistical need for experienced officers was less urgent now that the counteroffensive was running smoothly. The need for experienced tankers, however, was endless. I was transferred back to combat duty, not with the 3rd Armored, but with a support unit assigned to the aggressive push toward the Rhine. My new ride was an M4A3E8, the Easy 8. Climbing into the commander's seat of the E8 felt like stepping into an entirely new generation of machine. The old M4A1 had been a brutal, jerky beast, its vertical volute spring suspension VVSS, making every bump an assault on the spine. The E-8's new horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS, was a revelation. We were moving faster over rough ground, but the motion was smooth, almost fluid. The tank didn't buck and weave, it flowed. "She rides like a Cadillac, Lieutenant," my new driver, Specialist Cruz, commented during our first field test near Aachen. The wide tracks of the HVSS spread the weight better, allowing us to traverse the thawing, muddy fields without sinking to the belly. "She's faster and quieter, Cruz. But remember, the armor is still cheese to an 88, I cautioned. I refused to let down my guard, even with the technical improvements. That was the price of survival. But the real change was the gun, the long-barreled 76mm M1A2. It looked almost too long for the turret, giving the E-8 a more aggressive, balanced profile. The muzzle brake, a slight flare at the end of the barrel, hinted at the higher velocity. This wasn't the old pop gun that merely annoyed the Panther. This was an honest dueling weapon, finally capable of consistent penetration against the frontal armor of a Panther at reasonable ranges, provided we hit the right spot. More importantly, it had the updated internal systems. The wet stowage bins were standardized. The chances of us going up in that terrible, immediate flash fire, the Zippo effect, were drastically reduced. The engineers, given time, had done their job. The lives of the tankers were finally treated as valuable enough to warrant a 6-month delay in production. We were trained to use the new stabilizing mechanism effectively, a necessity for the American push doctrine. The Germans preferred to stop, sight, and fire with maximum precision. We preferred to move, fire, and keep moving. Speed was our armor. "The whole idea of the E-8, Lieutenant," my new gunner, Sergeant Miller, explained during a tedious calibration exercise, "is to get into position, fire the kill shot, and displace before they traverse that big cannon on us." "Exactly, Miller," I confirmed. "We don't win by being thicker. We win by being faster, by being an unpredictable blur on the horizon. We are hunters, not fortresses." This was the American operational philosophy made manifest in steel, mobility, firepower, and ubiquity. The M4 was finally equipped to fight the kind of war it was designed for, a war of pursuit, rapid exploitation, and overwhelming numbers. We were no longer sacrificing men to buy time for the engineers. The engineers had delivered the tools for the final, crushing act. It was mid-March. We were pushing toward a small, tactical bridgehead over a tributary of the Rhine, just outside a town called Remagen. It was a crucial choke point. Securing it meant the rapid flooding of troops and supplies into the German heartland. The resistance was desperate. The Germans had nothing left but scraps, scattered infantry, inexperienced militia, and a few powerful but vulnerable tank destroyers trying to hold the line. Our platoon of 4 M4A3E tests was spearheading the advance. The ambush hit us just as we cleared a patch of thick pines. Whiz-crack. The lead tank, Patton's Pride, erupted in smoke. Not the clean, bright fire of a Zippo, but thick, gray smoke indicating engine damage. It was immobilized. "Tank destroyer. Hidden. Left flank, 40 meters, by the barn," our gunner Miller screamed. It was a Jagdpanzer IV, low, heavily armored, armed with a deadly long 70mm gun. A formidable opponent in an ambush, but slow to traverse. "Cruz, hard left. Pop smoke. Miller, load AP." Our engine roared as Cruz slammed the E-8 into a tight turn, scattering mud and snow. I dropped 2 white phosphorus grenades from the turret, creating a shimmering, choking screen between us and the German kill zone. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my mind was cold, analytical. This wasn't panic. This was rapid calculation. We could not slug it out with that monster head-on. Flanking maneuver. Take us wide around the left, cruise. We need to come in on its beam. Ignore the smoke. We plunged into the uneven field, the HVSS suspension eating up the terrain. The superior speed of the Sherman was our lifeline. As we broke through the smoke screen, the Jagdpanzer, realizing its target was maneuvering, began to traverse its entire body. It was slow. Too slow. Miller, traverse. Target, rear right quarter. Shoot for the track or the transmission port. I was shouting the old M4 doctrine. Don't aim for the armor. Aim for the vulnerable systems. Miller steadied the 76mm gun. The new stabilizer meant he had a much better chance of accuracy while we were still moving at speed. Whump! The shell struck the Jagdpanzer's side armor, high up. A bright shower of sparks, but no penetration. The Germans had reinforced their sides too. Below that, Miller. Hit the running gear. We were 20 yards closer, moving into the kill zone. The German gunner must have spotted us. The Jagdpanzer stopped traversing and trained its main weapon toward our position. I saw the muzzle flash. A split second later, the world dissolved into noise and kinetic force. Clang! The 75mm round hit our front glassy plate. It was a tremendous impact. Everything shook violently. The lights flickered and died. A thin stream of black smoke momentarily wafted through the driver's periscope opening. We were hit, but not penetrated. The angled armor of the M4A3, combined with the slightly reduced velocity of the German shell due to distance and angle, held. More importantly, there was no flash fire. The dampeners worked. The whetstowed ammunition remained inert. "We're alive! We're alive!" Cruz yelled, coughing. "Fire, Miller! Fire!" Miller didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger, firing on the rebound. Whump! This time, the 76mm AP round hit the target exactly where I wanted. The thin junction where the main body met the track assembly, tearing through the drive sprocket. The sound was a loud, tearing shriek. The Jagdpanzer was instantly immobilized, its track broken, its drive systems mangled. It was a terrifying, immobile threat, but now it couldn't aim. We didn't linger. Cruz backed us into the protection of a shattered building foundation. As we reloaded, the rest of our platoon moved up, circling the immobilized threat. They finished the job quickly, utilizing 2 armor-piercing shots to the engine deck. The battle for the bridge was won, not by superior armor, but by superior mobility and, fundamentally, by the engineering improvements that allowed us to take a hit and keep fighting. The M4 no longer committed suicide upon penetration. It was a true survivor. The smoke cleared. The bridge was ours. I climbed out of the turret hatch. The adrenaline was receding, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. My tank, the Easy-8, was functional but scarred. A deep furrow in the paint where the Jagdpanzer's round had struck, a testament to the fact that marginal superiority in armor had been just enough to save us. I looked out across the scene. The German force was annihilated. Their heavy assets were smoldering heaps, monuments to their lack of fuel and their inability to retreat or repair. And what did I see flowing across the newly secured bridge? Not more tanks. Not King Tigers or Panthers. I saw an endless river of American logistics, GMC 2.5-ton trucks, fuel bozers, mobile kitchens, artillery tractors, carrying the absolute, crushing weight of the U.S. industrial complex. The sight was overwhelming. It wasn't glorious, it was relentless. I watched a young officer directing traffic, his face pale and tired, but his voice steady. He was moving thousands of tons of supplies per hour. I thought back to Normandy, to the burning M4A1 Hellion. I thought of Captain Maguire's cold, pragmatic explanation about production schedules and trade-offs. The M4 Sherman was indeed criticized, and rightly so, for its shortcomings. It was a dangerous machine for its crew during its early life. But those crews bought the time, paid for with their lives, for the engineers to implement the wet stowage, the better gun, the superior suspension. The Sherman didn't need to be the best. It just needed to be the most numerous, the most fixable, the most adaptable. The M4 served as a light tank, a medium tank, a tank destroyer, M10/M36, a self-propelled artillery piece, a recovery vehicle, a flamethrower tank. It was the chassis that powered the entire U.S. mechanized war effort. It was the backbone, not the fist. The King Tiger was a triumph of metallurgical prowess and individual combat dominance. It was designed to win battles. The M4 Sherman was a triumph of the American assembly line and standardization. It was designed to win the war. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. I finally understood my role in the war, and the role of the machine beneath me. We were just cogs, sacrificing individual glory for the sake of the overwhelming, unstoppable momentum of the total American force. The M4 Sherman didn't win the war by dominating any battlefield duel. It won the war by showing up every morning in numbers the enemy could never match, and by being simple enough that when it was broken, we could weld it back together by nightfall. We were the calculation, and the calculation proved correct. My arm still aches when the weather turns cold, a physical memory of the shrapnel and the fire. I survived the war because the engineers in Detroit finally decided that the lives of tankers were worth an extra step on the production line. But the deeper truth remains. We succeeded not because our tank was superior in design, but because we could replace 5 burned-out machines faster than the enemy could replace 1 broken track. The war wasn't won by a hero tank. It was won by the 4 million tons of steel, the 500,000 trucks, and the 50,000 M4 chassis that rolled off the assembly lines and never, ever stopped coming. War is logistics. Everything else is just commentary.